Jeff Wise, thanks for joining me on the podcast. Excited to talk to you today.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, before you're rolling in, I got a little bio that I've snapped off the internet, and I'd like to read it here so everyone has kind of a little bit of background of who you are, and then you can pop in with anything else that I'm sure I'm missing here. But today's guest, Jeff Wise, author, journalist, and aviation expert. You've tackled some of the most complex and mysterious stories in aviation. You spent over a decade covering topics blending human psychology, aviation, and survival, digging deep into the minds of those who have faced incredibly challenging situations. You're best known for your high-profile work on mysteries like the disappearance of Malaysian Airlines Flight 370, which we're going to dig into today. You explore that with two best-selling books. You got The Plane That Wasn't There and The Plane We Haven't Found Yet, MH370. Did I get those correct?
So I did an early version right after the plane disappeared in 2015 called The Plane That Wasn't There. And then then a couple of years later, I did a sort of updated version that I called The Taking of MH370.
Okay, perfect. So two of those out. Again, we're going to dig into those, but you've appeared on CNN, Fox News, other networks as well. And so today we're going to do a deep dive into MH370. So Jeff Wise, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. And yeah, just I've done about 60 episodes now of looking in this case, like in super fine slice detail, because it is a very technically challenging case. But people can, if they want to get into it there, it's findingmh370.com, and there's a YouTube channel too.
I'll link that down below because again, you have it now kind of releasing the podcast version of this where I've listened to it. It's very fascinating. Again, I'm excited to talk about this today, but you dive really deep and really technical on those episodes. So I think people will be interested in that.
Yeah. I was on a Netflix documentary called MH370, The Plane That Disappeared, and they featured my ideas pretty prominently in it, but in a super, super boiled down way and in a slightly erroneous way. And so I was thinking, you can't really explain a mystery as complicated as this in as short a space as that. And so the great thing and I kind of got into podcasting because of this, as a desire to sort of like go as deep as I needed to go without worrying about time constraints. So
that's the beauty of podcasting, I think, because you're able to have that long form content. You're not contained to a 5 or 3 minute little soundbite or even less than that, where, again, the topics we're going to talk about today, I think, are really complex and really challenging to just dissect it in a little 15-second snippet. When you're doing Netflix, so they interview you, and then I assume the producers, the editors, they're able to kind of chop it up. So was the content that you were putting out there and being interviewed about when it came out in the documentary, did you see things that were missing out of it, or what were your initial thoughts about it?
Yeah, I had been talking to them for several years. The whole project was delayed by COVID. They had come to me not really knowing much about the case. And I wound up speaking with a producer and one of the directors and having many long conversations and trying to walk them through this complicated case. Then they flew me over to the UK, sat me in a rented house and interviewed me over the course of several days, and then chopped that down. And they kind of simplified things to the point of inaccuracy, which I understand why they did it. It wasn't really horrible, but to make a long, to kind of cut to the chase, or I should say spoiler alert or whatever, I wound up thinking that there's a high likelihood that this plane was hijacked by Russians, right? And in the show, they make it sound like because MH17 was shot down by Russians, that's why I started to suspect them. And that's actually not true at all. I suspected the Russians before MH17 was shot down because of the mathematical oddities of the Inmarsat data. The Inmarsat data itself implicates the Russians. You don't have to hate Russians or hate Putin or anything to think that the Russians might have been behind this. So it ultimately isn't that important, but people attack me like, oh, you're leaping to conclusions. Anyway.
Okay, we're going to dig into all that. So I guess a good point to start would be framing out MH370, and then also probably talking about MH17 too, with that timeline, because all that's happening in that same time span roughly. So can you kind of frame, I guess, the problem set, if you will?
So what most people know. If I'm at a bar on the street or something and I say, oh, the missing plane, they're like, yeah, didn't this Malaysian plane disappear 10 years ago? And you're like, yeah, it did. And so the people know that a plane disappeared, but they don't really know exactly what happened. So the plane took off a little bit after midnight from Kuala Lumpur. It was heading to Beijing, which was about a 6-hour flight to the northeast-ish, northeast. And so it's flying. It takes off. It's flying a totally normal red-eye flight, no bad weather, no red flags at all. 40 minutes into the flight, the plane is about to leave Malaysian airspace. The captain calls up air traffic control and says the famous words, "Good night, Malaysia MH370, Malaysia 370." And then they pass the last waypoint in Malaysia, VFR waypoint called Igari, and they go several seconds later, like almost immediately, the plane goes electronically dark. Everything gets turned off. ADS-B, the SATCOM, ACARS, everything goes dark. This plane is invisible except on primary radar. And so later, the next day, the Malaysian military sort of realizes that the plane has done a 180, turned back the way it came, flew back over the Malayan Peninsula, kind of skirting the Thai border, flies up the Malacca Straits, and then it leaves the area of Malaysian military radar coverage. At that point, the plane is completely invisible. It can go anywhere it wants to. You know, most of the world, as you know, as a fighter pilot, most of the world does not have primary radar coverage. And so as long as if you know where primary radar coverage is, you can go anywhere else and you can just vanish. But that's not what happens. 3 minutes later, the SATCOM gets turned back on. And this is one of the major mysteries of the whole case. We don't know why it was turned back on. But it gets turned back on, and as a result, it starts sending these signals that get recorded at Inmarsat headquarters in London. The plane flies for 6 more hours, and then the final Inmarsat transmission goes. So there's 7 major sort of pings, which are these automatic signals that are sent by the SATCOM system every hour, roughly, unless it gets interrupted and is used for some purpose. In this case, there were 2 incoming calls from Malaysian Airlines to the plane, trying to figure out what had happened. Where they had realized that this plane wasn't where it was supposed to be, and they were trying to figure out what happened to it, so they called it. And this process of calling it reset the clock on the SATCOM system, because it was set so that if it wasn't used in an hour, this system, Inmarsat satellite, would send out a ping saying, "Are you there?" Essentially, it's like the way your cell phone communicates with a cell phone tower. Even if you're not making a call or sending a text, it still sends these signals just to sort of so that the system knows where it is, right? So that's basically where matters stood on March 8th of 2014. The plane had disappeared, engaged in this really weird behavior, and then vanished again. It actually vanished 3 times, I like to say, this case is so much different from every other plane crash that's ever happened. And so we really need to kind of develop a new set of tools to deal with it.
So when did the Malaysians realize that it was missing? So make the call, but again, if you don't check in with air traffic control, people are going to pretty quickly start squawking at you and squawking on guard. How fast did this process start happening?
It's supposed to be. You're better equipped to know this than me, but it's 3 minutes, is my understanding. Is that Ho Chi Minh was supposed to have heard from them. They didn't. They were supposed to, start making inquiries after about 3 minutes. I think it was more like 15 minutes or 20 minutes. And when a plane goes missing, there's a certain protocol you follow, but it basically amounts to calling up the last place it was supposed to be, asking them, did it leave your airspace? And then Malaysia was running a software program that was kind of projecting. It keeps track of planes partly by information that's coming in, but also partly by projecting into the future. Sometimes planes, this happened with Air France 447 quite notably in 2009. The plane was out over the ocean and the software was projecting its path along where it was expected to be. And so they thought everything was fine. It turned out that projection was wrong because the plane had already crashed. So this software told the Malaysians that the plane was over Cambodia for some reason. It wasn't really supposed to go to Cambodia, so it's not clear why they thought that. But to make a long story short, it was a couple hours before they kind of pulled the red lever, as it were, and it went into kind of emergency mode.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it really should be a matter of like 10, 15 minutes. And depending on the country, you're scrambling fighters to go intercept and figure out what's going on if someone's not talking. So that's what, the kind of the first piece where I'm like curious is, you're not talking to a plane and the plane hasn't checked in. You would think this is going to happen pretty quick. And I'm not super familiar with the Malaysian Air Force and what their capabilities are, but obviously they didn't scramble fighters or anything that night, did they?
No, they didn't scramble fighters. And this is one of these issues where people have a lot of assumptions that aren't really based on much. And I think we've all watched a lot of Tom Cruise movies, and we think that we sort of imagine like Air Force bases bristling with fighter jets and people, wearing flight suits and like ready to climb up the ladder. Malaysia has never been in a war. And I think, as someone in the military mindset can change a lot depending on whether a country has been at war recently or not. And, famously, when, the Civil War started, like people had no idea really, the military was tiny. They didn't really know how to fight a war. And so, as the Civil War goes on, like the nature of the battle completely changes. And similarly, like with kind of every war, it's like that.
Yeah.
And so Malaysia just is not going to scramble. That's just not their mindset.
Yeah, interesting perspective. I mean, at 100%, I can completely see that. And if you're doing this like over Europe or the United States, a completely different story. So that was one piece that I was curious about. It's just kind of starting with like the rudimentary piece. But there's so much electronic data that's being generated and pumped out. You mentioned the projection piece. So is that something that is pulling data from the plane, or is that a software system that, based on the ground, it has received some radar information, some ADS-B data, and now it's putting that projection out there, so it's thinking it's going over Cambodia or the Air France flight you mentioned. I
don't know exactly how this software works. It didn't turn out to be central to the case to the investigation as it developed. But my understanding is, my assumption is that it would be something like Flight Radar 24,
okay,
which uses ADS-B data to plot a track. If you get to a place where there isn't ADS-B coverage, it just kind of interpolates or assumes that you're going along your planned route. Because 99.999% of the time, that's a valid assumption.
Okay. So walk me through kind of the beginning where the search is happening, and obviously they're looking all over the place for this, but as you've researched and kind of dug into it, walk me through where the plane is going, in your opinion, how it's going there, and why,
Yeah. So 40 minutes into the flight, it goes electronically dark. It's seen to vanish from air traffic control radar. And historically, when that happens, the reason is that the plane has crashed. And when planes crash, they typically can be found within 5 miles of the last point of observation. This is what happened with Air France 447, which we could easily do. Like I said, I've done 60 episodes on MH370. I could probably do that many on Air France 447. An absolutely fascinating case, and in many ways very similar, or kind of rhymes with MH370, I would say. But so anyway, they start looking in the South China Sea where the plane was last observed. But at the same time, they start looking hundreds of miles to the west over the Andaman Sea. And it's only a couple of days later that we realize why that they were doing that. It's because at first the Malaysian military denies it, that they've seen this plane on primary radar. Now, we were talking earlier about whether the jets scrambled. Not only the jets not scramble, it's not even clear if anybody was awake and looking at the primary radar at the time it disappeared. They might have been, and just like, there's this kind of mindset that I think we all have, and I think probably military trainers need to get people out of. But there's this mindset of like, well, I'm sure it's nothing. Like, nothing has ever happened before. What are the odds that something is happening now, right? It's a black swan event. I've never seen it. I can't imagine that this plane is possibly turning back. Like, that never happens. And so... Or they might just have not been staffing the thing, or people might have been asleep. We know that one of the people in air traffic control, a superintendent, had to be woken up because he was taking a nap. This was in the middle of the night. There's a reason why people do things at 2:00 in the morning.
That's a very good point. And I've flown in and around that region in the middle of the night. And you're doing HF, some of it's CPLDC, some of it's VHF. Sometimes you're calling multiple times. And again, the joke is, I mean, the guy had to put his coffee down or you woke him up because you called on the radio 3 or 4 times. Like,
okay, so that rings true for you.
100%. Again, it's, you know, the usual route that I would fly that would be near that would be, you know, like a Sydney to southern China, somewhere in that region, right? So it's going to be in and around that spot, and you're talking the same countries. But again, I can 100% seeing the viability of that theory there, that someone was sleeping or not answering.
Very interesting. Let me ask you this, if I may. How aware are you, as the captain of a 777, of whether you're being surveilled in primary radar?
Unless they say radar contact. So, and actually the flight I just did, right? You're coming from Asia back across the United States. And in this case, the first place we're going to talk to that had radar was Anchorage. And one of the messages you'll get on CPLDC or via voice is radar contact with a position in reference to, you know, some point, so that you can verify it and everyone's on the same page.
Okay.
But you know, when you're crossing that, just, I guess, based upon geography or experience, like there's no radar, you know, there's not a floating radar station out here that's monitoring me. But when you're flying around the Pacific, especially that, you know, Asia, I go my experience from Australia up to China, unknown, you know, how far out does Malaysia, how far out does the Philippines, do they see, unless they say radar contact. They should give you radar services, or not radar services terminated. I guess it depends on the country, but you kind of can assume. And when you switch over to HF frequencies and you're coasting out over the water, that most likely you're not going to be in radar contact.
Sure.
So,
it's really interesting because it does seem like possible that whoever took this plane was cognizant of whether they were being observed on radar or not. And I say that primarily because it was less than 2 minutes after they left Malaysian primary radar that the Inmarsat, the satellite data unit, the SATCOM, got turned back on. And it almost, you have to wonder if those two time points are related.
I'm curious, you know, I would think, like, if it was me with, like, if I was coasting out over the United States, right, leaving, going across the Atlantic or the Pacific, I wouldn't know unless you had some kind of inside knowledge on what the radar map looks like at ATC, which, you know, a small country, maybe they have friends and they know, or, I mean, maybe that data is easier to come by.
Yeah.
But, you know, in the United States, it would be pretty tough. Like, I wouldn't know where to begin. But again, if you had a motivation to really figure it out, like, I would think you would be able to figure that information out.
And military intelligence would know.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
And
for that nation,
it's really interesting, actually. So can I ask you about your service as an F-16 pilot? What kind of roles were you fulfilling? Like, were you doing like interceptions or?
A mix. So, you know, the role we were primarily focused on is suppression of enemy air defenses and then defensive counter air. So defend a point against the hordes coming across the line. So long range air to air. But then the F-16's the jack of all trades, master of none, right? So close air support to suppression of enemy air defenses to long range air to air type things. But so in, like, if we're talking about penetrating into a nation, one of the studies, right, you're going to be relying on intel to brief you on radar sites, radar coverage, especially if we're talking about suppression of enemy air defenses. Like, we're trying to take down enemy radar sites. So if they've geolocated them, but if they're mobile, you know, all these things come into a factor. But when we're out there flying, my only indication that I'm being locked up by a fire control radar or a surface-to-air missile system, you know, it's a built-in radar warning receiver that's going to illuminate. And that's just telling you, yeah, someone's looking at you. But as far as like
the reason I'm interested in this, and I'm sorry if I'm hijacking the questions.
No, it's good. I think it's good. It's a good conversation.
It's really, really crucial to this case, at least from my perspective, as to where primary radar was located along places. And this begins with Thailand and Indonesia. Neither of Thailand, we think, saw it at the turnback, But then after the plane flew further west and was over the Andaman Sea, Thailand should have been able to detect it, but has said nothing about detecting it. Indonesia apparently has a radar installation in the far western part of their country. They have intercepted flights in the past, but they did not say anything about detecting this flight when they totally, regardless of what the plane did after it left a primary radar, it should have been detected by Indonesia, and they haven't said anything about that. And so that is one of the major mysteries of the case. But one of the key issues is how much primary radar is at. When I say primary, I mean both civil radar and military air defense radar. And so who could have seen this plane, depending on where it might have gone? And so I guess as an F-16 pilot, if you were, say, coming out of, imagine you were kind of coming from over the sea towards a country, would you know if you were being painted by primary radar?
You wouldn't.
You wouldn't.
Yeah. I think there are obviously systems out there, and if we talk about like surveillance planes that are more focused on collecting radar energy or signals intelligence, like they're going to have a better clue potentially of that. But I do think there are people, or there are countries, and there's intelligence that know the capabilities of like a military or even civil ATC as far as what their radar systems could see. But there's so many things that factor. It could be nefarious, or it also could just be system was down, system was degraded, system not capable of seeing it, train masking. Depending on where these things are, they might have a radar blind spot.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, there's some indication that Indonesia simply turned its radar off at midnight. Like they didn't really care. Again, they weren't really worried about invasion. They weren't really worried about air traffic, and they just didn't want to spend the money, and they didn't want to pay the people their salaries to sit there all night doing nothing. So they go home. Because
you brought up a good point, right? Like, again, I have to step out and say exactly what you said. Like, we've been a nation of war, right? For like 200 years, we're focused on it. But if a nation hasn't really been constantly at war, or if we're worried about planes being hijacked and we got planes sitting alert, like if that's not your mentality, but it's more budget friendly or budget conscious, like what's more important, what's going to weigh? It's like, yeah, if they just shut down the sites, but then they're also not going to convey the fact that they've shut down these radar sites and they just got someone manning ATC because it's cheaper, but they don't, I can see a lot of different possibilities here.
Yeah. I mean, one of the core ideas of air defense is that you don't want people to know what your air defense is. It's like, with your home, when you're trying to protect your home, you don't want a thief to know exactly where your locks are and where your cameras are. The less your attacker knows, the better. And I think part of that is also that you might have an air defense radar and you don't want to switch it on. You don't want to just be constantly painting the sky, right? Because that tells any adversary they know exactly where they can go to avoid it.
100%.
And so even if you do have and another thing people need to realize is radars cost millions of dollars. They use a lot of electricity. They are manned by people who cost a lot per hour to operate. And their range is not that big. I mean, it might be, maybe you can detect somebody out to 200 miles, but you imagine a circle that's 200 miles in radius, and imagine how big the Earth is, like how many primary radars you would need. Now, there are long-range over-the-horizon radars and stuff, but that is not something that a country like Indonesia is going to have. So I think one of the assumptions that I've had to wrestle with in talking about this case with people is people are like, oh, if it had gone to such and such a place, it would have been detected by so many countries' radar. Well, I'm like, tell me about Nepal's air defense capabilities. How many air defense radars does Nepal have? You don't know that. They might not have any because, frankly, Nepal is like stuck between China and India. They're not going to launch war with anybody. If anybody wants to overfly Nepal, Nepal's probably fine with it, actually.
Have a nut. I mean, that's the thing is I think you're hitting on a good point is, I mean, again, we take it for granted. Like, well, we just run our radars all the time, right? Because also if one breaks, like it's probably sourced somewhere in the United States or Europe where we can easily get a part. But if you're in Indonesia and a part breaks, well, now that system's down, Can you afford a new part? Does someone, like, are you bringing in a contractor from, the US or Europe to operate, or is it a local? I mean, there's so many things that come into play. So like, to me, it doesn't seem too far-fetched that, all right, you know what the flight schedule is. Guys are doing position reporting. That's good enough, because how often does a black swan event happen? So it doesn't seem too crazy that, maybe the radars are off. Maybe the radars weren't working.
I think the thing you mentioned earlier too is really important to realize, is that different places in the world operate in a different kind of style. And every place is not Switzerland. Every place is not super dialed into, like, we have to operate with maximum efficiency. We're going to get rated. We're going to have a annual review where our managers are going to rate our performance. Like, there's parts of the world where people take naps.
Yeah.
And so you can't assume that everything that happens is going to get seen. Another thing I'd love to ask you is that there's a thing I get from a lot of people is the Americans know. The Americans, and you're like, well, why do you think the Americans know? Because the Americans know everything. The Americans have satellites, they got aircraft carriers, they've got the AWACS, and I mean, there was this one of the major theories that was outlined in the Netflix show was that the AWACS, like, I don't think they just created a graphic of like two AWACS kind of like sandwiched MH370 and then used their advanced electronic warfare suite to like make it all vanish. It's like, dude, AWACS is air traffic control, right? I mean, detecting targets, managing air traffic. It's not an electronic warfare plane. There are things that do that, but like, you guys don't know what the hell you're talking about. And so this idea that the Americans know everything because the Americans have so much hardware. Yeah, the Americans know a lot, but there's a lot we don't know. Like, we definitely didn't prevent 9/11 from happening. And there's just so many, there's limitations. Now, again, the United States doesn't really want anyone to know what we know and what we don't know. That's part of intelligence. Yep. But this assumption that we probably did it because A, we can do everything, and B, we're the sort of people that would, because we suck, because a lot of the world hates us. But it's like, no, actually, we don't. And another thing you get all the time is, the U.S. was having a military maneuver at that time. And actually, it wasn't at that time. It was like a week later, and it was like 500 miles away, and it was like in the jungle. It had nothing to do with AWACS. These ideas get circulated, and people are just repeating them because they heard them on the internet. Most of the, I mean, I have this podcast on YouTube, and I have like a tiny, like, I appreciate the people who watch it, but it's fairly tiny compared to people who circulate UFO videos. There's a video of UFOs like taking the MH370 through a black hole. And people are like, oh, this guy's figured it out. He's got and it was like, well, where does this footage come from? Oh, it comes from a U.S. Navy, Global Hawk or something, and it filmed it. And also there were satellites overhead, multiple satellites, multiple drones. It's like, dude, even the United States doesn't have 100% round-the-clock worldwide coverage. It's expensive.
100%. I chuckled. I've seen some of that. The first part with the AWACS, like, I think every fighter pilot is probably laughing right now because of just, not to knock on the AWACS, they're great when they work, but they never work, right? And the fact that,
really?
Oh my God, yeah. If you're like, can you just give me like one legitimate radar contact and like pump it out via Link 16? That'd be great. So I mean, to me, it's comical. They're good. I don't want to like.
How are they giving you false contacts, or are they not giving you contacts that are there?
I mean, it is out. It is being phased out. Like, we are getting, the big dome circling on top, like that's going away. That's old technology. AESA radar, electronically scanned radar, like that's the future. Some nations have it. We're in the middle of procuring it. But C2, command and control, AWACS. So let's say in AWACS, this is pure, like, obviously, I don't know much about this. I don't know where the AWACS was operating in relation to it, but it's got to be pretty close, right? Like, again, a couple 100 miles, right, of where we're operating. And let's say they are doing an exercise. What's the AWACS focused on? They're worried about the exercise and what's going on. They're worried about controlling the fighters, because the fighters are going to be they're fighting, simulated bad guys, good guys. They're controlling the fight. When you have an AWACS flying around the United States or the East Coast supporting, fighters and exercises, what do they focus on? Their command and control of the assets that they have at it. Are there other airliners flying around? Yeah, absolutely. If one's coming into the airspace, which could be a real thing, in combat or even in training, all right, sure, they're going to talk about it. They're going to be focused, or if it's getting close to the fight, just for a concern. But if it's nowhere near where the exercise is going, like how many other airliners are out there flying? So I mean, not saying it's impossible, but my humble opinion, like the AWACS concept's kind of funny. You mentioned the again, I don't want to like get us into our own echo chamber here, but like you said, there's a lot going on in the world. The United States does have a lot of resources. What's going on in that time period? Well, ISIS like popped up on the map. Like how much energy and focus, I mean, everything we were doing was heavily focused upon ISIS and the fight there. We're still dealing with Afghanistan. So a lot of those resources get pulled there. Now there are other resources focusing on other things, but like middle of the night and, you know, Malaysia and the Pacific Ocean, like if it's not China, if it's not North Korea, like are we going to be pumping a lot of resources there? Like how many other airliners are flying around? And just the fact that, you know, I guess that's kind of my thing.
And also, just to draw a line under it, an AWACS is not an electronic warfare
Correct.
platform. It's not erasing signals. It's not creating false signals. That's not what it does.
Yeah, if you're again that time period with we had MH370 got shot down over Ukraine. I can't had Crimea been taken yet?
So MH370 disappeared right after Crimea was annexed. And the war at the point of MH17 had shifted towards the Donbass, the eastern part of Ukraine.
Okay.
And at that time, the tides had kind of turned. Russia was still trying to run it to make it look like an insurgency. And so it was all kind of GRU. It was all very special forces trying to use local troops with what they called little green men. These were Russian army units without insignias. And what happened was, because Russia hadn't committed regular military at that point, they didn't have all the resources of the Russian military. And so what they particularly didn't have was very significant air defense. And so the Ukrainian Air Force was using like their Su-25s to do ground attack and really being effective. And so they started to use some man pads, but the tide was turning against them, and I think they felt the need to do something dramatic. So what they did was they brought in a Buk, which is a fairly considerable, it can reach like 100,000 feet. It has a considerable range. It's not very good by like sort of modern NATO standards, but against a 777, it's more than adequate. And so they took this thing across the border. It was a part of a Russian army unit that was stationed in Kursk. And they brought it across the border. They moved it around. They parked it in a field. And it sat in this field for, I believe, 4 hours as planes traveled along a regular sort of highway in the sky that a lot of traffic between Europe and Asia travels over. And it sits there and it waits, and plane after plane after plane goes by. And then at like 1 o'clock in the afternoon, it targets a Malaysian Airlines 777 and blows it out of the sky. This immediately gets sort of retailed to the public as some militiamen had somehow captured a Ukrainian Buk, didn't know how it operated, and kind of was pushing buttons randomly and shot down a plane by mistake. And at the time, this was like universally accepted. All the Western observers were like, "Oh yeah, that sounds plausible. Like, why would you do this? It must have been a mistake." We now know that the entire operation was run by the GRU. The cover story was retailed by the GRU. And this is something I wanted to ask you, which is that I was talking to some military intelligence people in the aftermath because it didn't make any sense to me. And one of the things I wanted to understand was, like, if you're operating as part of a regular military unit, who's allowed to say fire this weapon? Because this is a strategic level weapon. This is not a man-pads. This is something that can change like history as it did. It's like sinking the Lusitania. Not just any old private can push the button. So it turns out there's a whole. One of the main things when you have a weapon of this power is establishing safeguards to prevent it from being used. And just as like if you're a Air Force plane that's carrying a nuclear weapon, you're not just flying out there with a red button that you just push it and like the bomb goes off. That's too dangerous. And so, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this. But first of all, the idea that this thing was that this thing did not have sometimes these things are sort of designed to operate in like a sort of squadron with an accompanying vehicle that has a radar on it, and it is able to paint targets itself, identify targets itself, IFF. This one was not accompanied by anything. It was all by itself. And so the idea kind of popped up. And again, this gets to like civilian assumptions of how the military works. They think, well, it didn't have the radar next to it. It didn't have radar. That's not actually how you a sort of distributed air defense system. All of this sensors are patched together into a network. All of the missiles are patched together into that same network. And so nothing operates independently. Everything is controlled from above with this whole network of sensors. And just because you don't have a radar part next to you doesn't mean that you're blind. Would you? I mean, sorry, that's a long rambling
that's
question.
good.
Does that? Would you agree with that picture overall?
I would. So one of the so a couple of things backing up first is the we talked about like the signals piece, and I think highlighting the fact of like, all right, that happens. So again, going back to like where are our resources going to be looking in and around that time frame? Like you have a airliner shot down, you have Russia that's playing games. Like we're probably going to focus a lot of signals intelligence resources are going to be focused in that region versus the Pacific, I think. But then when you talk about, all right, they plop out a single, I think I might be misspeaking, an SA-17. And again, it's a robust threat. So the aspect of it being integrated air defense, as a former SEAD guy, the suppression of any air defense is a complex problem set to solve. One, I need a radar site, ideally, that is emitting radar energy co-located with the thing that's going to shoot the missile, right? If they're sitting next to one another, I can geolocate it, I can shoot into it, I can drop a bomb on it and destroy it. The problem set gets really complicated when they're not geolocated. So you got just a missile truck sitting out there, but it's getting information from a radar site, right? Because again, as you alluded to, and I think you're right, or you're hitting it correctly, they're not blind out there. They're being fed information from another point. Now, where does it fit in the execution piece of it? So a little bit Western doctrine versus Russian doctrine or Soviet doctrine. And I'm going to make some assumptions based upon just my understanding of how the Russians operate. So in the West, we're very focused on decentralized execution. So I give you the rules of engagement. I tell you what the commander's intent is. You go out there with your 4-ship of fighters, your bomber, your platoon. You know what the commander's intent is. Take the hill, take down that factory. You know what the rules of engagement are. So I can do this or that. And now you go out there and operate independently, run your tactics based on your weapon system to most effectively accomplish that objective. The Russians, coming from the Soviet kind of style, is very centralized command, centralized control. And to parallel between the fighter world, so as a fighter pilot, we're going to send a 4-ship of F-22s out. That flight lead, again, knows what the commander's objective is, knows what the rules of engagement are. He is responsible for running the tactics inside his formation to accomplish that. Go do it. The Russians, on the other hand, it's very controlled. So the AWACS in the Western world is just going to provide you what the air picture looks like, hopefully. In the Russian world, it's going to be, Jeff, turn left 10 degrees, look 10 degrees high, target 1 mile, shoot, and like telling you what to do with your jet. So again, this is where the assumption piece be like, if that's how they run like their fighter world, and that's kind of how their doctrine goes, the fact that it would operate independently and just let a couple guys go out there and do their thing would be surprising to me. Again, I'm not a Soviet or I guess a Russian doctrine expert, but that's like a broad brush. So, yeah, you got strategic weapons.
Super interesting. I mean, it kind of jibes with what I've heard from other people too, and it gets frustrating to me because it gets very hard. People very quickly go to an assumption, a story that they tell themselves about what happened, and it's very hard to dislodge that once people settle into that. And so once this idea settled in that like this was an accident, like I don't think it was an accident. I think it was intentional. I think that military doctrine in Russia does quite explicitly say that like you don't. there's like 3 lieutenants attached to this Buk erector launcher, and they're not doing anything without like 2 ranks up in the chain of command at least. And I'll tell you something else that's quite interesting. I haven't been able to chase this down, but the first person to hear about the shoot down was Barack Obama. He was told by Vladimir Putin in a phone call that the Russians had set up the day before. And it happened so early in the process that I don't know if even air traffic controllers had realized it. And I think I've tried to determine when this call actually began. Yeah. And I've tried to determine when air traffic control actually, the penny actually dropped and they were like, oh my God, this plane has been shot down. Because I think that these things are so closely together in time. If you remember, it took Putin like a week to be told that the Kursk had sank. And so by 2014, he almost instantaneously knows that this Malaysian airliner has been shot down, and he's telling the President of the United States about it. Obviously, the chronological order of these events tells us whether Putin knew about this thing before it happened. If Putin knew about this before it happened, then very clearly it was an intentional planned thing, and they actually set up the call so that he could tell him personally. And I think if so, then of course American intelligence knows very well what the order of these events was. And so they might know that MH17 was deliberately shot down by the Russians. Now, the thing that people have a really hard time swallowing and revisiting their priors on is, why would Russia do this? Why would Russia shoot down this particular? They're not at war with the Netherlands. They're not at the war with Malaysia. Why would they blow this? Why would they sit under this airway, wait for 4 hours, and then blow this particular plane out of the sky? And again, when this happened, I already had researchers that I had hired in Ukraine and Russia working to try to figure out who the 3 men on board the plane from Ukraine and Russia were, and could they be suspects in this case. And so when MH17 got shot down, one of my first thoughts was, oh my God, are the people that I've hired in danger because they're getting close to like what could be an act of war by Russia?
That's a whole.
And I still haven't answered those questions, but they remain unresolved.
Yeah, I mean, it's super fascinating that we could dive into the whole that piece in of itself. Again, for one piece would be you're trying to apply rationality to an irrational player. Like why? I mean, again, not to go into Ukraine too much, but Ukraine's got grain.
I think you raise a really
gas.
Interesting point, but I would clarify it like this. No one's irrational, but people have motives that are opaque. You're an F-16 pilot. You probably are well familiar with John Boyd.
Yep. Okay.
I'm obsessed with John Boyd, who is kind of, in a sense, the father of the F-16.
100%. Yeah.
And the OODA loop, getting inside your enemy's decision cycle, trying to understand, and a big part of this idea of OODA loop, which kind of underlies the whole concept of hybrid warfare, which is, I believe, the kind of war that we've been engaged with for the last 10 years, or more even, is a key part of the OODA loop is understanding how your opponent sees the world, what they know, what they take from what they know, and what they're going to plan to do next. And I feel that Russia is inside our OODA loop in a major, major way. And one of the problems, and I did an episode about this, and one of the major questions that someone like Boyd grappled with is, okay, if someone is inside your decision, well, one of the features of someone being inside your decision cycle is that strange things happen that you can't explain, right? And you're baffled. And frankly, when I look at how baffled we are about MH370, I'm like, we should really be asking if somebody's inside our OODA loop. And when I see how Russia is the GRU is retailing a narrative about MH17 that the West is blindly accepting, that smells a bit like someone being inside our OODA loop. And so I've been trying to sort of apply to this John Boyd formulation of understanding the world to this case and to our general situation, and being very frustrated because I am one person. And I can't lever the entire, information processing economy of the West to process something that it's not set up to process. So I sort of feel like the entire weight of the sort of punditry and journalism and think of all the foreign affairs experts around the world who sit around pontificating about Russia and what it's, as you say, this seemingly, you've triggered me a little bit, John, because you said that we're dealing with an irrational actor. And I'm like, no, they're not irrational. They're highly rational. It's just that they seem irrational to us because they're inside our OODA loop and we don't get it. We don't understand what's happening.
I'm more, on that, I'm more cynical too. Is like going with the timestamp, right?
Right.
Intel, like your one each average Intel officer, Intel analyst, very quickly peel back that timeline. You need to know. So it's either being covered up or I'm completely out to lunch. But I mean, very early on, it was like, oh, this is just like a rogue group that went out there and launched a missile and took down an airliner. Like, I personally don't believe that. So I'm either completely wrong or it's being covered up. That's the cynical version, in my opinion.
I mean, maybe covered up is too prejudicial a term. I mean, like we said, intelligence doesn't want you to, part of being an intelligence officer is not broadcasting to the world everything you know, or maybe broadcasting misinformation about what you know.
Right.
I mean, we know that the U.S. doesn't want everyone to know what it knows, because it's like, look at Assad in Syria. The Obama administration said there's a red line. If Assad uses chemical weapons against his own people, we will act. And then they did. Now, did U.S. know or not? I don't know. But Elliot Higgins and this group called Bellingcat used online social media information to paint a very convincing case that, in fact, they had used chemical weapons. And eventually it came out that no, they had used, and basically the red line was called for BS. And so one can easily imagine a case in which the Lusitania gets sunk and we'd rather just pretend we have no idea why it sank. Like, I don't want to go into World War I, frankly. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I buy that as well. And I guess when I say cover up, so I would agree, prejudicial. That's pretty harsh, but there's also pieces that, again, if we know it, maybe the way we know it, we don't want the means and the ability that we are able to find that information out. Or again, like, this is going to trigger World War III and let's just hold off and do it. So, all right. We digress. That is a super interesting. That's a whole nother thing too. Again, we get there's so much we can talk about. I want to jump back to MH370. So we pivoted over to the MH17 just because I think, again, that time period, there's so much going on. And if the argument is, oh, well, the U.S. military, the U.S. intelligence complex knows everything that's going on in the world, I argue that there's also a lot of other things that have the United States' attention that probably is going to be more of a resource focus versus the middle of the night out over the Pacific or, the China Sea.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
But again, these are all assumptions on my part. So the plane has made the turn back. It's flown for 6 more hours. Can you kind of talk me through? Because I would like to talk about some of the passengers that were on the flight, what you might think was going on, how it might have been, why it was going dark, then reconnecting the Inmarsat, how all of that works. There's a lot to dig in there.
Yeah. So in the weeks and months that followed, there were a lot of people in the media, online, sort of speculating what could have happened. A lot of theories have been put out. One of them made its way into a couple of them made their way into the Netflix documentary. But and to this day, many of the stories that get published about MH370 sort of posit that there's so many theories about MH370. How can we possibly understand? How can we separate the wheat from the chaff? This is, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding of the case. There are not a ton of theories about what happened to MH370. There's like some crazy notions or sort of half-baked ideas that are put out there. The fact of the matter is somebody took this plane, and there's only two ways to control a plane. And so whoever took it through one of those two means. There's a really obvious way to control a plane, which is from the cockpit. You have all of the controls right there. It's designed for you to control the plane. And so to this day, most of the authorities associated with the case, and in fact, the Prime Minister of Australia even went on TV and said that the Malaysian government had told him in the week after the plane disappeared that the pilot must have taken it because there's only way to control a plane, and that is from the cockpit. and the cockpit is locked, and we know that the pilot said "Good night, Malaysia MH370," and then a minute later, all these things happen. It must have been the captain. That is the dominant narrative about this case. However, it is not strictly true in this case, because unlike many planes, I fly Cessna 172s and Cherokees and gliders, and in all of those planes, yes, the only way to control the plane is from the pilot's seat. However, the 777 was different. The 777 was the first fly-by-wire plane made by Boeing. And as such, you didn't really fly the plane from the cockpit. You were merely providing inputs to a computer system underneath the cockpit in a place called the electronics bay, or the EE bay. And everything that, I mean, there's actually a couple of mechanical linkages to some spoilers, etc. So it's not 100% true. But basically, all of the flight control surfaces of this plane are controlled by actuators that are moved by electrical signals sent. And there's some hydraulics too, but like to keep it simple, computers sending signals to move actuators that move the flight control surfaces. So if you like Jeff Wise's whole world over the last 10 years is trying to debate the question of whether, okay, here's another thing about the 777 is that there's an unlocked hatch in the first class cabin. It was configured as business class on this particular flight. But anyway, it's the front of the passenger cabin. There's an unlocked hatch under a carpet that if you lift it up, you can go down there and you have basically unrestricted access to computers that are all connected to each other on a kind of, it's almost like a LAN, like a sort of wired internet. It's called this ARINC 629 bus. It has no security layer. You can clip onto that ARINC bus and it's like getting on your home Wi-Fi. And imagine you have a home computer system like, I have a printer that's attached to my computer. I can print out, anybody that's on that network can print out from my printer. The analogy would be if you're on an ARINC 629 bus and you know what you're doing, there's really nothing to prevent you from overtaking the flight control surfaces, taking over all the communications, doing everything that the computers on this plane do, and everything on this plane is run by computers. So to say that you can only fly this plane from the cockpit is not strictly true. However, the authorities who are looking for this plane have set the probability in their kind of Bayesian inferential logic. They have set the probability that somebody took over this plane from the electronics bay to 0. So in Bayesian thinking, which is how the scientific method basically works, is that you're constantly updating your priors. Like you basically have a model of how this thing is set up, and as new information comes in, you modify your model. But if you set one of your assumptions to 0%, there's no new incoming information is going to alter. Zero times anything is still 0. And so lately in my podcast, I've spent a lot of time talking to people who are experts in aviation cybersecurity and ask them, is it impossible to take this plane from the electronics bay? And the answer is it's not impossible. Now, people have different assessments as to how plausible it is.
Right.
But the fact is that probability is not 0.
That's really, I guess, why do they say it is impossible, or they've taken it down to 0? What is the justification? That's Malaysian government?
I think it's kind of like, imagine that you want to send your kids to college and your spouse's plan is to buy a lottery ticket, right? And the lottery ticket, let's say, has a 1 in a million chance of winning. You might effectively, for the purposes of assessing this plan for sending your kids to college, you could just assume that this chance of this success is 0. Right? The success is going to be so unlikely that let's just forget it. Like, let's consider that a non-workable plan.
Yeah.
And I think that in their heart of hearts, when people, first of all, this kind of thing was not, it was not, cybersecurity at that time was not really even much of something that people thought about in aviation. There had been a case, and I did a podcast about this as well. There was a case in 2011 where the Iranians used GPS spoofing to take control of one of America's most advanced drones. There was some subsequent work that was done by Todd Humphreys at the University of Texas. He was on the podcast talking about how you can do that. Now it happens all the time. Now, if you're a pilot for Finnair, and I've talked to pilots from Finnair, this is something that this makes your life a pain in the ass constantly. They've had to shut down airports because of this kind of thing. But at the time, it was really unknown. So it was very unfamiliar. And I think here's another reason why they set the probability to 0. When they looked at this data that they got from Inmarsat, it looked like it was telling them exactly where this plane went. And they got very excited. And, you know, I don't know if you remember the feeling like you're in the 8th grade math and your teacher gives you this complicated problem with lots of division and multiplication. And then the answer comes out to be like, and it's like, I got to divide 63 by 7. And then it comes out, it's like, it's 9. It's a nice round number. And you're like, oh, that must be it. Because my teacher wouldn't give me an answer that was like 7 and 32/46, right? And so they got this nice, it looked like this plane flew in a nice straight line at a normal airliner speed into this particular patch of the southern Indian Ocean, and it's going to be there. And it made sense. Plus the pilot could set it and da-da. And so what happened to them was that they got an idea that seemed really compelling. And they were like, they believed it. They believed it. Now, belief is a word that should not exist in a scientist's vocabulary. There's only relative probability. It's not very satisfying. People love, because one of the things about getting involved in MH370 is that it's really taught me how contrary to human nature science is. Because human beings have a deep, deep emotional need to believe. They love to have a theory. And so people are constantly coming onto my blog or my podcast and like leaving comments like, I know that this happened. So many people are like, I know what happened to this plane. And sometimes it's something that they had in a dream. Like something came to them, they had a vision. And I don't know how to tell these people, like, look, your vision is not really probative.
I'm sorry. That it was funny. While you were saying, I actually Googled. I was like, I'm making sure, what was out there. But the RQ-170, I mean, the B-2 looking drone that they spoofed.
Yeah.
Again, that's 2011. This is 3 years later.
So they reverse engineered it, made something called the Shahed, and now these things are piling into Ukraine and like blowing things up constantly. So yeah, that really sucked that happened.
Well, but the thing too is they spoofed it, they reverse engineer it, did that. But also, I guess where I could say the probability of this, Russia's flying 777s, right? They have access to 777s. So if you had to learn how to manipulate and do, I'm not saying it's Russia, right? But if the 777s proliferate across the world, so if you had to go figure out how to do it, it's not like it's a classified manual. Like,
well, this is a really interesting question actually, because an aircraft like the 777 is packed with proprietary information. The Boeing and Airbus are locked in a very lucrative duopoly / rivalry. It is very hard to understand exactly how a 777 works. And this has important ramifications for cybersecurity, because if you want to understand the cybersecurity vulnerabilities of, say, an iPhone, you can just go buy an iPhone. Or you can probably access documentation online, what have you. 777 has documentation for pilots to operate the aircraft. And I really love that you're a 777 pilot, because I think you can tell me if you think this is true. But I had a guy named Ron Rogers on who was actually who was a test pilot when 777s were entered into commercial service, and the airlines had their own test pilots who flew them and to understand how they worked and everything. And so he was actually there at the dawn, and they had questions for the engineers. It's like, how does this work? And in many cases, the engineers themselves didn't know, and they would have to go find out and maybe ask a vendor. And so the 777, and like, as you say, the Russians, the only way to understand what a 777 is going to do in any given situation is to have a 777, or maybe to be Boeing. And not even Boeing. And so I talked to an excellent aviation cybersecurity expert from Embry-Riddle in a recent episode, and I said to him, like, okay, how could you understand for sure whether a 777 could be hacked in the way that MH370 appears to have been? And he said you would need to assemble Boeing and a roster of vendors to get together and do a penetration test. It would be like a significant undertaking. It wouldn't be that hard to do if you had people willing to do it. But this knowledge, I guess what I'm saying is this knowledge is highly siloed. And so when people came out, and in the the Netflix documentary, there's a highly respected sort of expert in this particular field of discussion who says this is impossible. You can't control the 777 from the electronics bay. He has no basis for saying that. And yet in the context of the documentary, when he says that, it has the effect of telling the viewer, okay, Jeff Wise is wrong. What Jeff Wise is proposing is impossible. It's frustrating to me because, and I'm gonna do a very soon upcoming episode about this. It's not true. I mean, it simply is not true that we know a priori that a 777 cannot be controlled from the electronics bay. And so for everyone to get, and you ask, like, how come they called it 0%? That's why they went to 0%, because somehow some people said that it's 0%. And what you have a lot in the whole case of MH370 is people playing outside their realm of expertise. You're a 777 pilot. You don't know how a 777 is wired. You know some about it. You've got the manual, and that tells you a lot. It tells you some of the things that. So in this particular case, to get back to what happened to this plane, everything goes dark, and then an hour later, the SATCOM system gets turned back on. And for years after this case happened, every 777 pilot I talked to, I would say to them, how would you electrically isolate the SDU? And the answer I most commonly got was, what is an SDU? And it's a component of the satellite communication system that we know got depowered. Now, how do you depower it? You probably, I don't know, if you fly 777s like today, right? You're currently a 777 captain?
First officer.
First officer. Okay. So if your captain said, hey, I'm going to go take a leak, while I'm gone, would you please electrically isolate the SDU? Like, what would you do?
That's no idea. Maybe there's a circuit breaker for it, but I can tell you too, in my experience, different methodologies based on countries and operators, et cetera. The philosophy now is dark cockpit. So if any lights are illuminated, like that's something wrong. You do turn off switches occasionally, but it's usually tied to some kind of maintenance function with a part not working. You got to isolate a valve, yada, yada, yada. You can only do that with certain things, right? In my limited experience, just 5 years, one circuit breaker have we pulled and reset over Australia, but it was via SATCOM, talking to tech pilots, maintenance. And
you didn't pull it on by yourself. You asked.
Correct.
You did it under the advisement of technical experts on the ground.
Correct. Now, if you had a malicious intent, studied it, and you need to do, I guess, something. I guess backing up too. One, yep, I can confirm that the E&E bay, just turn the latch and hop on down there. Could I control the plane down there? Absolutely not. I have no idea. It's like a networking bay, like you've alluded to. Like there's nothing. But if you had a nation state operating behind you that had to plug this USB into here and do X, Y, and Z, maybe that's a different story. We can dive into that further. But again, I have no idea like how I would isolate the SDU. Maybe it is a circuit breaker and it's right over my head and I can find it and pull it and it shuts it off. I mean, even if you're...
So it turns out that there's two ways to do it. One is to go into the electronics bay, and there are 3 circuit breakers on the far left of the thing that if you know where it is, you can pull them. But it seems like the pilot wouldn't have had time to do that between saying goodnight Malaysia. He only had a minute between saying goodnight and everything going dark, so he couldn't leave the cockpit, go do all this rigmarole, and come back. So the other way to do it is to isolate the entire left AC bus. And this is a pretty dramatic. Now you said like you would never pull a circuit breaker unless someone on the ground was telling you to do it. Why? Because you don't really know what's going to happen. These electronic systems are interrelated. They're complicated. There's unpredictable causes and effects. You're sort of trained, and this is something that this is why I love talking to 777 pilots, because there's something about operating a plane for your living that like there's things that culturally you do and things that you culturally don't do, right? And when people started to develop these ideas about what the Inmarsat data meant, they kind of just took it for granted that the captain turned off the SDU and then turned it back on again. And there's 3, and I've tried to push back against, and uninterrogating this assumption. And I've tried to push back against it, saying that, like, I think you really need to interrogate it because it's only because of this reboot that we have all of the data for the last 6 hours. And that it's only because of this data that they had this search area that they were confident was going to work, which, of course, it didn't. There's three things that I point out about it. First of all, as we've been discussing culturally, 777 pilots don't even pull isolated circuit breakers, let alone isolate an entire half of the electrical system of a plane that they don't know what it's going to do. That is just not something a normal 777 pilot would even cross their mind.
100%.
Secondly, there's no motive. Even if we do posit that the captain Zahari, wanted to commit an elaborate suicide attempt, there's nothing motivating him to do this. Now, one idea that has been popular on the internet is, he wanted to make sure that he wasn't leaving any kind of a trace. So it wasn't enough just to turn off ACARS. He also and turn off the IFE that would allow customers to send texts and make phone calls, but he would actually want to just depower the entire SATCOM. The problem with that is that he was on primary radar at the time. So like the idea of him like wanting to work really hard to make sure he wasn't sending any signals, he didn't need to send signals. He was on radar, and he would certainly know that. He flew over Butterworth Air Force Base. And so there's basically, it's very, to my mind, very problematic that this event happened. And to my mind, it's powerfully contraindicative of the idea that the captain did all of this. This plane winds up in an electrical configuration. Sorry, someone's calling me. I'm just gonna. It's very. Something very strange happened to this plane, and it's troubling to me that no one else in the entire world, apart from me, is willing to like really shine a light on how weird this is. This plane winds up in an electrical configuration that no 777 has ever been in before or since. Like 777s don't fly around with ADS-B turned off, Mode S turned off, no radio, nothing, but just only the SATCOM turned on, but they're not using the SATCOM. It's just there's no reason to be in this state, and yet it's because it's in this state, we find ourselves in a situation where this plane is offering the world a single clue, a single piece of information that it will later be able to use to determine where the plane went, only because of a very peculiar set of circumstances, which include the fact that the Inmarsat satellite that it's flying under has run low on fuel and is wobbling in orbit, and the fact that the SDU is a kind of SDU made by a company called Thales, which is bought by Honeywell, and it does a certain kind of. Now, there's no way we have time to get into the whole Doppler precompensation algorithm, but suffice to say that there's a whole bunch of really kind of. None of them is unusual by itself, but when you add them all together, it's a bit like a combo on a lock. Like, it's very unlikely that this plane happens to be in a configuration where there's a single source that tells. Now, why is a single source a red flag to me? Because from a cybersecurity aspect, like for instance, one of the major worries that people have now about cybersecurity in aviation is something called ADS-B, which is a signal that planes send out to tell other planes and ground controllers where they are. And it really is helpful for safety for everyone to know where everyone else is. The potential problem, it hasn't really caused too many problems yet, but it could, is that there's no security layer for ADS-B. And it's sort of designed so that you can't really have a security layer, which means that it's trivial to spoof an ADS-B signal. I could pop up and say, I'm right over downtown LA airport. I'm right over LAX. And I'm coming in at 500 miles an hour from directly overhead or something. And so if you do that, you're going to have there's these automatic systems where that's in the cockpit where the system will tell the pilot, pull up, or it'll command the pilot to do things. Now, the pilot doesn't have to do it, but if you're on short final and you get a collision avoidance warning,
you actually
have
to
pull up. You're probably going to do a go-around at least. If
you have a resolution advisory, so ADS-B, if you're flying and I'm flying and our planes we're pointed at one another, and air traffic control has assigned me 4,000 feet, this heading, and the plane, you get traffic, right? Because it's starting to say, hey, there's a guy that might be a conflict. But then you get a resolution advisory. You are required to follow the resolution advisory. Now, common sense, if the resolution advisory is driving you into the ground, hopefully you use that piloting skill and don't drive yourself into the ground. But again, when it goes to spoofing, so again, people are not familiar with that, basically tricking GPS, tricking, doing something that is not real. Spoofing is a term used in the military. Spoofing happens all the time with GPS, but ADSB is something as well. So again, you really could mess some things up there.
So it's something that a cybersecurity expert is going to worry about is a situation in which you have a single spoofable signal. Now, how can you resolve that? Well, try to find another. Try to back it up. And with ADSB, you can sort of like, one of the things you can do is if you have, you can try to figure out where the signal is coming from. There's a thing called multilateral. I don't want to get the word wrong, but there's a way that you can inspect the environment around you to try to judge how reliable this particular signal. And GPS spoofing, for instance, another case. Somebody is injecting false information into your GPS receiver. You can. This is something actually just today, a couple hours ago, I was reading about how in Finland they're using DMEs, this old kind of radar location information, to sort of cross-reference what GPS is saying. So if my DMA says it's not really plausible that you're over the North Pole all of a sudden, then I know, okay, I'm going to either find another, maybe I'll go to another GNS system. The point just being, it's dangerous. You are in a place of potential danger if you're relying on a single source of information. And this is exactly the situation that we find ourselves with MH370, where we're relying on a single signal that comes from a source that could be altered. We know exactly how this could be altered. The fact that there only a single signal exists is itself suspicious. This plane shouldn't be in this kind of, this does not normally exist. And so everything about this is weird and, to my mind, deeply, profoundly suspicious. And yet I find myself trying to relay these concerns, and they're falling on deaf ears because everybody feels that the case has already been resolved.
So with the Inmarsat being the single source of information that's laying the breadcrumbs for people to follow, how, in your mind, or I guess, what do you theorize, how would that happen? How would that be possible to trick the system and then to lay this out? Because again, I think you were talking about some Doppler, which again is a really complex thing.
Let me try to see if I can do this in a couple sentences, because it's not worth getting completely derailed. It's a little complicated, but what they did was, when the Inmarsat satellite is looking at the Earth, it's seeing billions of people. And all of these people have cell phones. These people have like garage door openers, lots of sources of radio energy. And so in order to focus on who they want to focus on, they only look at a very, very narrow band of the electromagnetic spectrum. And this is very helpful. Also, as you know, bands of the electromagnetic frequency spectrum are expensive. And so one of the jobs of a satellite communications engineer is to make sure that everyone stays in their sandbox. And this is easy if you're on a boat, but it gets hard if you're on a plane for this reason. Planes travel pretty fast. Now, not really very fast as a percentage of the speed of light, which is what causes Doppler shift, but enough that if you've got a really tiny band, you could get out of that band if you don't do what's called Doppler precompensation, which is, okay, if you're flying towards me, the signal that I'm getting from you is too high. Doppler shift is shifting it upwards. And so if you want to make sure that I receive it at the right frequency, you're going to send it low. So if your relative motion to me, just for a point of example, is 10 hertz too high, you just send it minus 10 hertz. And so then the motion will add the thing and it'll come in at the right frequency. So the rational way to overcome this problem is if I'm moving around, I'm flying around, and I'm getting signals from the satellite that are 10 hertz too low, I know that that's a result of our relative motion. I'm just going to add that in. I don't need to do any calculations or anything. I'm just going to make that sort of automatic frequency compensation. Unfortunately, while this is a great idea, it's such a great idea that somebody patented it. And so you can't use it if you're Thales. You have to come up with another way to do Doppler precompensation. And so the way that they came up with is, I'm going to use my IRS, my inertial reference system that uses GPS input as well, to tell me where I am, how fast I'm traveling. And so when I know where the satellite is, and I'm going to mathematically calculate our relative velocity, our Doppler shift, and how much I need to compensate for it. Obviously, I didn't know anything about this when this whole mystery started. Had to be explained to me. But so where does this get this information? It gets this information. The box itself is actually on the back of the plane, sort of like imagine where a shark's fin is. That's kind of where it is. But the information that it uses to do this math comes from the IRS, which is in the electronics bay. So if you're in the electronics bay, you have access to the AirInc bus, 629 bus. You can theoretically feed bad information into the SDU, and you can basically make it transmit at whatever frequency you want. And it turns out that another researcher that was working with me did some math, and he realized that if you change a single parameter within the memory of the SDU, you can make it so that the math equation will spit out the reverse value that would imply to if you're a very clever Russian electronics warfare expert who's working together with the GRU to try to figure out how you can make a plane disappear out of thin air, you might recognize that all we need to do is get somebody on board this plane, mess around with the Doppler precompensation. Now, you would have to turn off the box and turn it back on again to make all this to work. But again, we've seen it. The box did turn off and turn back on again. And so it's theoretically, there's a very easy, look, this is not easy. This would be a massive undertaking. This is, I don't know if it's like quite on the scale of the Manhattan Project, but this is as you mentioned before, a state level cyber hijack operation, which, by the way, Russia is one of the world's leading, perpetrators of cyber hijacks. I mean, not cyber hijacks, sorry, but cyber attacks. And so they somebody was saying to me, to do a cyber attack, you need a threat actor, and you need a vulnerability. You need what he called a threat surface. I'm sorry, a vulnerability, an attack surface. Like you need a range of vulnerabilities that person can attack. Russia at this time was starting to become a highly aggressive threat actor, was doing a lot of hacking attacks, and was doing assassinations, using attacks to shut down power grids, like all kinds of nefarious actions, like a really wide range of actions. So from my perspective, you have the means, the method, the opportunity, and the motive. I mean, you've got this threat actor that was doing all kinds of chaos, and it just seems sort of right up their alley, frankly.
So 10 years has transpired since this happened, and not all 777s are created equal, and airlines buy different things. But there is a lot of data that's being pumped off these planes, from even like engine data. I don't know if it's pumping out GPS location, but I assume it's probably time stamping and probably a GPS location. So this is another weird thing about MH370 is that Inmarsat had different levels of service that you could subscribe to, and Malaysian Airlines was like kind of teetering on the verge of financial insolvency at the time, and they subscribed to the cheapest level called Classic Aero, and it did not provide embedded GPS data in the signal. If they were Singapore Airlines and sort of paying for the highest level of service, all of that data would have been embedded. And again, you would not have that single thread of data. You would have had a confirming sort of side channel of information that would have told you exactly where the plane was going. So it's the ambiguity itself is, to me, suspicious. Yeah, interesting. It's interesting that data wouldn't even exist. They just didn't share it, based with the subscriber. But, Inmarsat would have that data just in your basic level plan that you don't get access to that,
It's like a Tesla. Like every Tesla, they just need to flip a switch and your car will like have all these features. But no, they're like, no, you have to pay us to flip the switch.
Yeah, interesting. So what I've heard you talk about, there are 3 passengers in business class. Can you talk to me about your theory there? And
there was one passenger in business class, a Russian businessman named Nikolai Brodsky. He was sitting like 12 feet from this hatch. He was kind of not an oligarch, but he was like a successful businessman doing timber products in Irkutsk. Interesting guy. I had hired a researcher, very talented researcher who like talked to a lot of his friends and his family, and he sounded like he was kind of a MacGyver. He was like his hobby was diving under the ice of Lake Baikal, He wasn't really a fan of recreational like diving on tropical reefs. He liked to dive in deep dark water. Like he had the kind of it's called mixed gas breathing, where you go like 400 feet down. It's only used. There's not. People don't really do it recreationally. It's mostly used by the oil industry and by the military.
Okay.
And so he apparently was coming back. He'd left early from a dive trip to Bali. He was heading back to Irkutsk. There's sort of like some blank spots in his biography that we don't really know about. He's a mysterious guy. He certainly would have been capable of something like this. And I thought it interesting that like one of the questions is like, how would you, if you wanted to hijack a plane, how would you neutralize over 200 other people? And one idea is that you would depressurize it. The masks come down, people are stuck in their seats, breathing through the mask. After 15 minutes, the chemical generator runs out and they asphyxiate. This is a guy who is very skilled at breathing through masks under, psychological pressure. So that was interesting. Then in the back of the plane, sitting right under the satellite data unit, actually, were these two Ukrainians who were in their 40s at the time, seemed very physically fit. They had served in the Soviet army. We don't really know what. I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out exactly why these guys were on the plane. They were involved in the furniture business, and they supposedly were going from a furniture trade show in Malaysia to another trade show in China, but the second trade show wasn't for another 3 weeks. And they weren't going to the city where the trade show was. They were going to Beijing, which doesn't really make any sense. So we don't, and I've tried to figure out like what exactly business these guys were in. They supposedly had a factory. They didn't have a store. It's not really clear who their customers were. They'd had a website that had just launched a couple months before. It's a big question mark as to what these guys are really doing. It doesn't really add up.
Yeah, we've never seen a front company do anything nefarious.
Yeah, exactly.
So what do you think happened? This plane, it turns west, it goes south, it goes north. What happens to it?
I think that they got into the electronics bay after the plane took off. They waited until the plane had left the last waypoint, and they knew that they were no longer being observed. They knew that they had a window of at least 3 minutes, but possibly longer, depending on how alert people were, where nobody would be paying any attention to what they were doing. So I think at that minute, they, from the electronics bay, made the plane go dark, turned it around, probably depressurized the interior of the plane, probably shut there. Another thing you can do in the electronics bay is shut off the oxygen supply to the pilot and the captain and first officer's oxygen supply. Turned around, flipped them lock it straight. Once an hour had passed, they were out of primary radar. We know that they turned to the north. So this Doppler precompensation, and because of the mathematics of the Inmarsat data, we know that the plane took one of two routes. One went to the south and one went to the north. Right after they left primary radar, we know, because of the geometry of the signals, that the plane turned towards the north. So I think they had already turned towards the north, and they turned on this box. They obviously they would have been given this sort of pre-built computer by Russian intelligence that they could plug into the AirInc bus that would be able to fly the plane probably on a pre-programmed route, and that would also generate signals that made it look like they were doing kind of the mirror image of what they were actually doing. And so they would create, it would look like the plane was flying into the remote ocean while they were actually flying north over Nepal, and ultimately into Kazakhstan, over the Himalayas.
So why would they do that?
That's a great question. And one of the answers is that based on the experience of Air France 447, they knew that the disappearance of a plane would be a major news event, would take control of the headlines. And indeed it did. And so, as I said, they had just annexed Crimea, which was the dominant headline at the time. as soon as this plane disappeared, people became obsessed with it. It was catnip. It was like they basically seized control of the news cycle. And I started going on CNN at the time, and I was going on like 5 times a day. It was anytime CNN tried to air something that wasn't MH370, their numbers would drop. It wasn't like they wanted to talk about nothing else for 3 months. It was like the viewers demanded it. And so that's part of it. And then the other part of it, I think, is that they had discovered in the wake of Air France 447, I think Air France 447 was a direct inspiration for MH370. I think it showed that once a plane had left active surveillance, like no one would pay attention to it for a long time, and that you could do things. And I think that they recognized that under certain very limited set of circumstances, they had an idea, like a magic trick. They could make a plane disappear, but it would only work under a very narrow set of circumstances. And that if they didn't use it, it would go away. And I think I imagine there was a certain kind of mentality of like, if we don't do this really clever, wonderful thing that we figured out how to do, we won't be able to do it. And so I think it was like they had an arrow and they wanted to shoot it. But that's just pure speculation on my part.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a lot of this is, I mean, you got to speculate here because we don't know what happened. I can see, as I was thinking,
I think it's really important to like think carefully about what we mean when we say speculate, because there are like informed guesses and then there's just wild ass guessing, right? If I tell you the moon, I had a dream and the fairy godmother told me that the moon is made of green cheese, like that's just like that's not a theory,
right?
That's just some wild ass thing you pulled out of your butt. But if I say that like I don't know, if I have reason to think that this thing is possible, and I know that we have to have an explanation. I don't really have evidence for it, but it fits with the general vibe of the piece. I think that is not quite so irresponsible. So yes, I don't have any evidence that this was the motive, but I think it's like worth at least putting out there because it seems psychologically possible to me.
Right. Well, you're based on operational procedures, normal operating, guidance and logic. Because if you just back up to, all right, you're crossing a fur, you're going into another nation. It's the middle of the night. Is someone sleeping? Are they not sleeping? What's normal? Like the radios are really bad in that region usually. So you might not talk to someone for 10 or 15 miles and try back. But again, if you need to know, all right, if I turn around, that's literally and figuratively 180 degree turn and out from anything normal. The last place air traffic would be looking is like, why would anyone turn around? Malaysia would be talking to me. You've created this confusion, or you've given yourself an out to start executing your plan, whatever it might be. So it seems a possibility, and it seems probable. I might argue more so than orbs circling and putting into a black hole. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so we're operating in a really degraded information environment. There is the authorities have essentially thrown up their hands and said, like, we have a theory, but we can't. Here's an important thing we haven't even mentioned, is that hypotheses have, testable ramifications. And in 2014, when they came up with this idea of the idea that the plane had gone south into the Southern Indian Ocean, there was a direct, there was a testable hypothesis, which is that we will find, they were very confident they would find the plane on the seabed. That would prove their hypothesis was correct. I said, because even back in June, as soon as I realized that this signal was spoofable, and not only was it spoofable, but there were all these other strange things that otherwise were kind of inexplicable, like the fact that the SDU was rebooted. I came forward and I said, look, I'm not telling you that this is 100% true, but I think we need to acknowledge that there is at least the possibility that we should explore that this plane was cyber hijacked. And that theory too has a testable hypothesis, has a testable conclusion, which is that the plane won't be found on the seabed. And there was another actual ramification that terrified me at the time, which is that if this plane was cyber hijacked, there is a very dangerous actor out there who is very sophisticated and very ruthless and is willing to do harm in a way that, frankly, is beyond people's imagination. And not only all of that, which is scary enough, but these people are so much smarter than us that they can pull off this magic trick. And not only will we not figure it out, but we will be unable to grasp it, even if somebody like me explains it to them. Like we are like the dodos on Mauritius when the sailors came aboard, came onto the island and started whacking them over the head. The dodos were like, I don't know what's happening, but all my friends are lying down and I don't know why. Again, in the OODA loop, somebody is inside our decision cycle so overwhelmingly that strange things are happening and we are unable to even imagine what that thing could be. That to me is absolutely terrifying. And so I predicted two things. And at the time, believe me, I wasn't sure that this was the case. I'm still not sure that this is the case. I'm just saying it's not 0%, and I would like people to take it seriously enough to look at it, because there's two predictions it makes. The first prediction is that the plane will not be found on the seabed. The second prediction is that we are in a kind of we're in a sort of hybrid war with a very dangerous, capable, sophisticated, and ruthless opponent. Both of those things turned out to be true. And so even if you feel that what I'm describing is extremely unlikely, I think you have to, in good faith, admit that both of my predictions came true and the predictions of the authorities did not come true. And that is perhaps indicative of what we should be thinking about now.
For the seabed search, obviously the ocean's a big spot to go looking for, really challenging to do. How accurate and refined was the Inmarsat data to allow for an accurate search area? I mean, when was the last data point?
I think the accuracy of so there's two, again, we can get into the weeds pretty quickly here, but the accuracy of the BTO data that they used to lay out their probability map was about, I think, 5 kilometers. Okay. So for every point, it's like plus or minus 5 kilometers. And they developed a really rigorous mathematical procedure, which I've outlined in numerous episodes of my podcast. But a lot of people, again, this is sort of civilian assumptions. People think, well, it's a big ocean. It could be anywhere, right? Well, no. I mean, think of it as a GPS signal, right? If your GPS is telling you that you're 0 degrees north, 0 degrees east latitude, do you know exactly where you are? No, there's a certain error bar. There's a certain margin of error. And the same way with this, it's like this is telling the authorities where the plane went, and there's a certain amount of uncertainty, but that amount of uncertainty is much less, I would argue, than the area that they've already searched. And just this morning, I got a journalist in Britain saying, oh, did you know that Ocean Infinity is talking about restarting the search? And I'm like, they don't have any reason to search anywhere in particular. Like they have no sound analytical reason to look anywhere in particular, because they've searched all the not even high probability, but just like not tiny probability. So I'm quite frustrated by this, actually.
Thoughts, because there's been parts and pieces that have washed up that have been claimed to be part of the plane. What insight do you have to that?
So people were starting to listen to what I was saying about the idea that all of the entire search was predicated on this one set of strange signals that nobody could really explain. And then pieces started to wash up. The first piece washed up 15 months after the disappearance on the French island of La Réunion, which is in the western part of the Indian Ocean. And almost instantly, people were like, okay, this is that kind of, remember I was talking about having a confirmatory stream of data. Here's your confirmatory evidence. Okay, this plane really did go into the ocean, because now we have pieces of it. There was the flaperon that washed ashore. This is a part of the wing, the right wing of the 777. It actually had serial numbers on the interior part of it that indicated that matched records, handwritten records in the factory in Spain where this piece was made. So we know that this piece really did come from MH370. And so for most people, this was like, okay, case closed. Jeff Wise is officially wrong. The plane definitely went into the southern Indian Ocean because we have this piece. And of course, I was like, you're right. I guess I'm wrong. But are we 100% sure? Because there is a possibility we can imagine, although people resisted it, which is that maybe whoever took this plane, seeing that there was questions being raised as to whether we could rely on one piece of information, took it, put it in the water, and then left, made sure someone found it. Okay, there's actually a way to test this hypothesis, because barnacles grow this thing was covered in barnacles, and barnacles grow at a certain rate. And I being me, was like, okay, well, how big are these barnacles and how fast do they normally grow? Come to find, and again, I've done multiple episodes about this too, come to find that these barnacles seem to be much smaller than we would expect. As barnacles grow throughout their lifespan, they get bigger and bigger and bigger. These things look like they've only been in the water like 2 or 3 months, which means that there was a year-long gap between when the plane disappeared and when this piece went in the water. And this is true of all of the pieces. There isn't a single piece that has marine life on it that matches the age of how long it should have been in the water. Now, here's the problem. This isn't dispositive because we don't really know that much about how barnacles grow. So what I'm engaged in right now is a project to try to fill in that hole in the data and to try to understand really rigorously how barnacles grow on things that float in the water. And it helps that there is actually a program that NOAA runs, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. They have 1,200 14-inch plastic buoys that are circulating in the currents all around the world. And as they're circulating, they're transmitting their location, their GPS location via satellite, as well as water temperature and other things. It helps them. They're very useful for weather prediction, among other things. But also they're constantly accumulating barnacles and other marine fouling organisms. And so what I'm trying to do is try to collect some of this data. I'm actually in conversation with NOAA and with the Scripps Oceanographic Institute that actually owns these drifters. And because what I think we can do is, if we can get a really robust data set to calibrate lepus growth, the barnacles that grow on these things, we can really understand how long what the could have plausible range of how long this flatron was in the water. Now, it might turn out that, no, come to find actually the rate that these things grow in this particular body of water actually matches the flatron. And I'm wrong, that this thing actually must have been in the water for 15 months, and therefore it wasn't planted by Russians or anybody else. In which case, I will have disproved my own hypothesis, which is, I think, what's important to have a hypothesis that you can disprove it.
Yeah. I guess it is not debated, right, that the plane flew for an additional 6 hours, correct? Is that pretty much a given fact and everyone accepts that?
Everything is debated. Everything is debated, but it's not really debated by people who are serious.
Yeah.
I mean, there's people who think it flew into a black hole. So, yeah, everything is disputed. But no,
okay.
Serious people, I think, agree that it flew for 6 hours.
Yeah, and it also made turns because it flew back up to the northwest, then either flew south or flew north, correct?
I accept that. I think the authorities accept it. I think I sort of stipulate that happened.
Yeah, because you're either, like, why would you fly for 6 hours? Why would you turn around? So one, as I just kind of talk out loud, like, if you're going to commit suicide, if I was going to commit suicide as a pilot, I'm probably not going to fly around for 6 more hours thinking about it. If we have a hypoxic event and everyone blanks out, unless they rebuilt the flight plan, what's the plane doing? Who's controlling the plane? Who's turning the heading knob, or who's built in the waypoints to be flying, flying around?
People bring up hypoxia a lot, and it just really doesn't match the behavior that we observe.
Right. It wouldn't make sense.
But 6 hours does get you up into Kazakhstan, where there are more than one Russian bases with long airstrips where, no one is around. They're a bit like Guantanamo Bay in the sense that, like, it's Russian territory in Kazakhstan. So,
yeah. I could, it doesn't seem too crazy or far-fetched for me that something like this could happen, especially knowing
We've been talking for a while. It takes this long for me to explain what I'm talking about for people not to be like, oh, Jeff Wise is crazy.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to the thing, when in history, right, have we heard of something that the probability is near zero, right, and it turns out to be the case. I'm not saying this is the case here, right, but it's a really weird incident. It's a very strange. You have a modern... obviously at the time, I'm arguably one of the most advanced transport category aircraft operating in the world, GPS environment, and then poof, gone.
Why are people so committed to saying that a cyber hack is impossible? This is one of the great mysteries to me. It's like, it would cost you nothing just to say, let's look at it. Let's prove to ourselves that it's impossible. Let's not just assert that it seems crazy. Why don't you actually prove to yourself that the proposed attack has a flaw, an unrecoverable flaw? Why not do that? I don't understand why people are invested in ignoring this idea.
Yeah, I did an interview with Joe Wise back in May. He's an industrial control systems engineer. He spent the last 20 years of his career kind of focused on this. One of his arguments for there's cyber attacks, and there's ransomware. There's all these things, but he goes to Stuxnet. He goes, one argument is for like industrial control systems. Not saying a 777 is, but it's kind of, I think you can draw analogies between the two. It's not sexy, right? It doesn't catch the news. It's not holding Colonial Pipeline ransom for millions of dollars in the grip, right? It's a control system was designed for an engineer to monitor flow rate, pressure via remote access. And when it was designed, no one had this thought that people would have malintent and go out there and hack a valve that's running a pressure system to a fuel tank. But then lo and behold, bad guys figure it out and you can overpressurize a fuel tank. I mean, there's so many things. And he goes into detail. I mean, Stuxnet's a prime example of someone hacking industrial control systems and destroying Iranian centrifuges.
I told the story of Stuxnet at the beginning of my last episode. I interviewed this expert from Embry-Riddle, and this idea is that, we can control. And here's the thing is that people, you asked like why people didn't think about this at the time. The world is changing, and it's changing quickly, and it's changing profoundly, and people don't really have the mental models that really correlate well with what's going on. And so a few months after MH370 disappeared, the FAA commissioned a report from a former Boeing cybersecurity guy who was familiar with Boeing aircraft. And they basically said, broadly speaking, what are the cybersecurity vulnerabilities of the U.S. aviation fleet? And they looked at like legacy aircraft like the 767, these sort of more contemporary planes like the 777, and then the sort of state-of-the-art, what they call E-enabled planes like the 787. And the 777 turned out to be the most vulnerable of all of the planes in the fleet because a lot of things were controlled remotely or in a sort of integrated way, automated way. In the 787, there's even more, but they already started to think about issues like security, and so there were kind of ways to break it. The 777 is a sort of transitional technology where they'd started to automate tons of things, but hadn't started to worry about the implications in terms of vulnerability. And so it was kind of a jaw-dropping thing for me to come across this document because it was just like, this plane is wide open. There is no security layer on the Airing 629. And another thing is that traditionally, in terms of security, a lot of aviation has been pitched to the assumption that people couldn't physically access a plane. You can't getting in the electronics bay. It's like it's not locked, but it's also not trivial to sort of distract the flight crew long enough that you can pull up the
Well, it's the middle of the night. It's after meal service. All the lights are off. People are sleeping. I mean, it's not. I mean, I've ridden in business class a decent amount. Like it's not like a party going on. You could very easily open the hatch. The hatch is not that. It is not that far fetched in my mind that you could easily open the hatch. Down the hatch you go and close it. If
that's
you're
really fascinating. Can I ask you about your previous guest? So he is an industrial systems engineer. And he had contemplated the possibility of a cyber hijack on MH370?
Not on MH370. We didn't talk that. We're focusing on power grid. And my thing is, if you have to face an F-22 squadron and you're a country, like, would you want to do that? Or how would you eliminate that from the get-go? One, I mean, you could figure out who the pilots are, kill all the pilots. That's kind of messy and that's problematic, but they're not going to take off, right? Because you can't not everyone go fly an F-22. But I mean, if you overpressurize the fuel tanks at the base and then there's no fuel at the base, I mean, that kind of solves an immediate problem. Now you can get fuel in other ways, but all these little things are vulnerabilities. And again, that goes to the point that when these industrial control systems were coming about and things were getting tied more and more online and more remotely, the intent behind the engineers and the designers, they weren't thinking about cybersecurity. And the 777 is 90s technology. I mean, that's really when we're talking about frame of reference here. Like if we back up 10 years, people really like ransomware, hacking, like that really wasn't at the forefront of people's minds, let alone back into the mid 90s when they're designing this. I actually just learned this past week, 777, I was doing a landing sim. and F-16s fly by wire, 777 fly by wire. And I have felt it every single time I land the 777. There's a point where you touch down, and then you have to actually increase backstick pressure or just not resist the nose falling to the ground. And that is induced to make the plane more like a 767. So airlines, pilots,
well, I mean, as a 172 pilot, I will say that, like, yeah, you want to hold the plane in the flare, you want to hold it off the runway as you bleed off speed. Eventually, you get to the stall, and then the plane settles. You're not going to bounce. You're not going to porpoise. But so yeah, the idea of gradually, every instructor I've ever had has yelled at me to pull back, especially important in tail draggers. But are you saying that, like, the 777 won't do that naturally? So they basically had to program this behavior into the flight control system?
They do, because as a 767, right, it's not fly-by-wire. Well, as you slow down, less air moving over the control surfaces, so it gets heavier on the controls to hold that same attitude. So they have to induce that in the 777 because it's fly-by-wire. So they induced, and the way they explained it, the engineers are trying to figure out how to do it. Like, well, we'll just add more of a force that's required to hold it. So it's like that is... you're getting the same feel as the wind or the air moving over the control surface is reduced, because if you just hold it there, like, the plane knows what you need to do in the 777, right? But going from the 7.6, whatever, you're like, oh no, I need to, like, increase backstick pressure because that's normal.
So the plane is basically programmed to operate in a certain way just because there was a legacy aircraft that the pilots had trained on. And now for all time into the future, people are going to have to, like, pull back on the stick in a way that, like, they don't really need to at all, but just because it's
that's what they did.
It's just the way it's done.
Yeah, and there's probably some parallels and ties there with the the 737 Max. The engineers put this like, oh, that's what we need to do because the airlines, they don't have to retrain or get another type rating for pilots or whatever it might be. But again, you hold through. It's like, well, this is now how it's always going to be for the rest of time. And you're like, well, why? You don't need. I've never flown a 767.
This was obviously a major factor in the Max crashes. It was also a major factor in Air France 447, where you had a control law, and the system had changed its control law without. I don't know if it didn't tell I think it probably there was an indication, but as you say, like with the Christmas tree lights of indicators going off, at least one of the pilots didn't realize that they were no longer in a control law where it was impossible to stall the plane. And so he stalled the plane.
The 447 literally, fell from, the mid 30s in a pancake into the ocean in a completely flyable plane, which is wild.
In less than 5 minutes, in less than 5 miles. Yeah, it was crazy. It was really crazy. And I remember thinking at the time, first of all, another parallel to MH370, you had a lot of people like me, journalists and whatever, self-described pundits, sort of coming up with theories. Like, this is what I think happened to this plane. And in my recollection, we were all wrong. Because what happened was such a weird combination of arcane, pitot tubes getting jammed with ice and, like, the reaction and the control modes. And just this idiosyncrasy of humans' reaction. Like, two of the pilots on the flight deck realized what was happening, and one of them didn't. And I thought at the time, okay, this is so weird. This will never happen again. And then 5 years, almost the exact same thing happened. I want to say China Air. It happened in Indonesia, where almost the exact same thing happened, where they got disoriented, confused. There was a control mode switch they didn't realize, and they pancaked into the ocean.
I think that's one of the things, I've been flying 777s for 5 years now. It's the 447 is something that's still talked about, human factors, all that is still talked about in training. I think probably more so today, like unusual attitude training. I assume most Western airlines do that because it's amazing. Well, like, I don't know what I think is simple stuff, but again, completely flyable planes, but for whatever reason, either input error as far as like being able to process the data that's in front of you, people make mistakes. Like, the human makes mistakes, and you're like.
So I wrote a book about fear in 2009, and the reason I wrote this book about fear is because when I was doing my flight training in Southern California, I was coming back over the hill into the LA, into the valley, and somebody came, and I had like 40 hours at this point. And some guy came like roaring over me, like it was probably like 200 feet or something. I like wasn't actually danger, but like it was so. The next thing I knew, like there was all this wind rushing sound, and like I had no idea what was going on, and I was like, this is like the thing about. There's a kind of a paradox in when you do your flight training, which is that you realize very close to around the time that you solo, is that when you're alone in that airplane, if you panic, you will die. Right. But if you think about that, you will panic and you will die. So you have to like just not think about this pretty obvious truth. And so fear really does. So the idea that like if you do like every 6 months or something, some kind of recurrent training where like you're in this situation, you do it, that's great. But when you're actually in the shit and you're freaking out, you know, you can easily do things that don't make any sense. And I think that there's many accidents where a lot of pilots will read their accident report and go, I wouldn't do that. And I think one of the points I tried to make in my fear book is, yeah, you would, or the chances are a lot better than you think.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it goes back to, it is nice in the military because you're doing sims and emergency procedure sims so frequently. I mean, even still, a lot of human factors come into play, and you make mistakes. And again, it's easy to Monday morning quarterback, but I always say, like, you know, those that have and those that will. But the emergency procedure sims, it's nice because when you have something happen, you're just and hopefully going through and solving the problem, and you're not even thinking about the fact that, like, well, I could probably die here, right? You're just like, this is a problem set.
If you have it wrote, like if you have it really well practiced, things that are really well practiced, you actually do better when you're scared. Yeah. Things that require intellectual activity or trying to figure out or troubleshoot, there's a reason that everything is a checklist.
Yeah. Take the thought process out of it, and it's just step 1, step 2, step 3, because it is a high stress, most likely a high stress environment that the time to be figuring it out or thinking about for the first time is not when it's happening. So,
yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, I'm so glad you reached out to me to talk about this. You're an extremely valuable resource to me because you know tons of stuff that are profoundly interesting to me. And we didn't even talk about, I talked about the OODA loop, but like this whole idea of how that works. The idea that the father of the F-16 went on to develop the theory of victory that I think is so foundational to, I mean, people say he's like more important in the Marine Corps than in like the Navy or the Army, but this idea of the control loop is so prevalent across industry, across the military. It's really kind of the air that we breathe nowadays, and I think a lot of people don't really know where that came from. But there's some people who go to work and they're chasing after a KPM, and they don't realize like that all has to come back to like decision cycles. And so I would really love to sort of, once I sort of stop obsessing about MH370, I'd love to talk about like this kind of larger view of like, how do we control our decision cycle instead of having someone else control our decision cycle? That was Boyd's basic message. But the idea that he went from being this insanely talented fighter pilot instructor to being a guy who basically wrote the basic theory of air combat, to then kind of being the godfather of the F-16, the F-18, which are still in demand today. You know, the fact that, and I would love to talk to you about F-16s in Ukraine, like, but you know, we don't have to talk about everything today.
Yeah, we can do this.
You will continue to exist. I will continue to exist.
Yeah. It's super interesting. It's funny. I actually have a newsletter, which I just had a bit last week on the OODA loop, just a blurb, right, to expose people to the OODA loop and what that concept is, and how important it is. And then several months back, had a John Boyd. I went to Georgia Tech. He ended up doing his master's at Georgia Tech. Right. But when you listen, like hear about John Boyd, I'm like, man, I have accomplished nothing in my life. You're like, God, this guy just foundational to so many aspects. He was
so amazing in so many ways and had such influence that isn't really appreciated. He was also miserable. He was a deeply, deeply unhappy guy, and he died quite young.
Yeah.
So would I want to be John Boyd? Absolutely not. I'm very glad he existed. Although his legacy is like it's like anyone who develops a weapon, it's like, yeah, you can use that weapon, but your enemy can use it against you. And if they're better at it than you, then you got a problem.
Right. Well, this has been fascinating, Jeff. I really appreciate you taking the time today. I will have all your links down below. So people, again, the podcast series you do on MH370, obviously, I don't know, you have like 30 plus episode, I think, last time I looked at it, right? So obviously a very deep dive.
I did 31 in the first season with a co-host, and I've done another, I've lost track, I think 23 or something in the second one.
Okay. I mean, I was locked in the first season.
But yeah, if people go to findingmh370.com, it's all there.
Okay.
And people can ask me questions. I mean, obviously you've been talking to a lot of people who have a lot of specific knowledge. My whole idea is that I want to solve this mystery, but not just by me kind of spouting off. I want to talk to I want to find the best, most specific experts in every kind of aspect of this case, whether it's a marine biologist. There's like 7 marine biologists in the entire world who study the Lepus antitifera barnacle. I've read all their papers. You know what I mean? Get me the information. Let's get specific. This is technical, you know?
Yeah, I love that. Well, Jeff, thank you again for taking the time today. Really enjoyed talking to you. Super interesting. We'll have to do this again because there's a slew of other topics we can dive into.
100%.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.